On the night of October 17, 2019, a 47-year-old woman named Ada Quintal stepped out of her family's cabin in rural Michigan to take her dog for a walk and have a smoke. It was very late, it was about 1:30 in the morning. Now, this cabin where she was staying was very isolated. It was about a half-mile away from any neighbors, but Ada actually enjoyed the solitude. She was surrounded on all sides by forest and swamps, and the wilderness actually made Ada feel a lot safer than when she was back home in the densely populated Detroit area where she lived full-time. And this was because just a few months earlier, when she had been back home in Detroit, she had been the victim of an unprovoked attack. She had been out in the city around all these people in broad daylight, and this guy came up to her and just jumped her, broke her nose, gave her a concussion, and then ran off. But the scariest part of this attack was not the fact that she had been brutalized. It was that this guy did not appear to have any reason to attack her. He didn't know Ada, and Ada had not been robbed or anything. It was like he just randomly identified her and attacked her. And the guy had never been caught. And so this ordeal had had such a profound impact on Ada that it really began to affect her health, both mentally and physically. She started to just kind of decline. And on top of that, she had been laid off from her engineering job, and so now she was unemployed and seriously depressed. And so recently, when Ada's uncle had called her and offered to pay her to come out and live in this 2-story family cabin and fix it up for the winter, Ada had jumped at the chance. I mean, not only would this solve her unemployment issue, but also she loved this cabin. It had been in her family for 75 years, and some of her fondest childhood memories were in this cabin. And so she looked at this as a chance to kind of get away from the city and just be in her happy place and kind of reset and recover from the trauma of the attack. And so for the past week, Ada and her boyfriend had been staying in this cabin and doing small repairs and cleaning it up. But 2 days earlier, her boyfriend had to leave and go back to the city where they were actually fixing up another property, a condo. And so now it was just Ada and her dog. But that was totally fine with Ada. She liked being out here by herself, so this was no big deal. But tonight, she was feeling frustrated because she couldn't sleep. About an hour earlier, she had taken a pill to help her sleep, but so far it hadn't worked, and so she was feeling kind of wired and anxious. And so she had decided to go on a walk with her dog in hopes that that would clear her mind and allow her to finally get some rest. Now, these roads that surrounded this cabin were kind of small and zigzaggy, and there weren't any street lights. I mean, this is not exactly a good place to go for a nighttime walk. But Ada knew this place like the back of her hand, and she also carried a 9mm pistol in her pocket, just for protection. And so after walking for a few minutes down one of these dark winding roads, Ada's dog stopped to relieve himself on a bush. So as the dog was going to the bathroom, Ada just casually smoked and waited. But at some point, the dog just stopped going to the bathroom, turned slightly, and began growling, and its ears perked up, and it was looking off into the darkness right ahead of them. And so Ada instinctively took her flashlight and raised it up and aimed it in the direction her dog was looking. And right away, the cone of light illuminated these two eyes looking right back at Ada. And immediately Ada knew what she was staring at. It was a mountain lion. And so doing her best to stay calm, Ada slowly reached into her pocket to pull out her gun, but before pulling it out, the two eyes blinked shut, and then she heard it kind of turn and run off into the forest. It was gone. Once Ada was sure the mountain lion really was gone, she breathed a sigh of relief, and then very quickly tugged on her dog's leash, they turned around, and she hustled back towards the cabin. When Ada reached her cabin, which was all lit up because she had left all the lights on before she had left, she jumped up the front steps, she opened up the door, she went inside with her dog, and after letting her dog off the leash, she shut and locked the door. Then she grabbed her phone and texted her boyfriend to tell him about this mountain lion. And then after hitting send, Ada felt relieved to be back in her cabin, but at the same time, she still felt very on edge. I mean, she had been, just a few feet away from a mountain lion in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. But as Ada was doing her best to calm herself down, she heard this noise coming from outside the living room window, almost like twig snapping, like somebody was walking past the window. And so the way this cabin was set up is when you first walked inside, you were in the kitchen, and then the back half of the cabin was a living room, and then there were also stairs leading up to a second floor. But from in the kitchen, you had a clear line of sight into the living room, and vice versa. It was kind of like one big room with two functions. And so from where Ada was standing in the kitchen, she could clearly see the window in the living room where this noise had kind of come through, but because the inside of the cabin was all lit up and the outside was dark, from her perspective, all she could see was a reflection on that window. So to look outside that window to see what had made that noise, she would need to get right up next to the window. And so feeling pretty nervous at this point, she walked across the cabin, she made her way towards this window, and then she pressed her face right up against the glass to look outside. But all she saw outside was just darkness. I mean, there was nothing out there. And so Ada stepped back from the window and started to wonder if maybe the sound she had just heard was maybe that mountain lion. Maybe it followed her back here. That was terrifying, but at least she was inside. But also she was thinking to herself, mountain lions are not known for being aggressive towards humans, and they wouldn't come up to her cabin like this and prowl around outside. That's just not what mountain lions do. But Ada didn't really have any other explanation, and so she told herself, it's gotta be nothing, there's nothing out there, this is a safe place. And so she kind of forgot about the noise, and she took off her coat and put her stuff down, and then she sat down on the couch in the living room, turned on the TV, and tried to relax. But only about 20 minutes later, when Ada had finally relaxed and was even thinking about getting into her bed and going to sleep, she heard another noise coming from that same window in the living room. And this time, when she looked up and looked out that window, despite the reflections inside the cabin, she could clearly tell there was something moving outside of her cabin. And it was definitely not a mountain lion. It looked like a man. And so Ada had to stifle a scream, and then instinctively she lunged for her gun on the coffee table and then darted behind the couch and crouched down to make sure whoever was out there couldn't see her. And then, with gun in hand, she began calling out to the person out there that, "Hey, I'm armed. If you come in here, I'm going to shoot you." But it was just silence. And then Ada strained her ears to try to hear any sound that would give away where this person went. Were they still outside that window? Had they moved somewhere else? But all she could hear was the sound of the wind whipping outside and an owl hooting off in the distance. But then, right as Ada was starting to wonder, did I really see somebody out there? Is this all in my head? That's when she heard the distinct sound of footsteps on her front porch. And so again, Ada had to stifle a scream, and she darted to the other side of the couch, preventing the person from the front of the house to seeing her now. Then she grabbed her phone and she was dialing 911, and she was about to hit call when she stopped herself. And she began to wonder, am I just totally overreacting here? I don't know if there's somebody out there. I could be hearing things. Or maybe it's just like an animal or something. And also, deep down, Ada knew that ever since that attack in Detroit that summer, that basically everything scared her. And she was starting to wonder if maybe she was just being totally paranoid and there was nothing going on. And she didn't want to embarrass herself by calling 911 and having them come out here and finding nothing. And so Ada decided she would call her boyfriend, and so she called her boyfriend, and as the phone is ringing, she's listening intently for any other footsteps outside, but she can't hear anything. And then her boyfriend, he didn't pick up. It's also like 2:30 in the morning at this point, but her boyfriend doesn't answer. And so after that, she tries calling one of her friends, and her friend does pick up. And right away, Ada just began telling this friend about all the things that had happened that night, from going out and seeing the mountain lion, and then coming back in, hearing the sound, and now hearing the footsteps on the front porch. And, she was worried that maybe she was just making it all up, but she was still really scared. And even though Ada was trying to be composed as she was telling her friend, her voice began to crack and she began to cry because she really was scared. And the friend just said, "Look, I'm going to call the police on your behalf. It seems like it's worth having them come out just to make sure you're really okay. Give me the address and I'll tell them where to go." And so Ada would give her friend the address, but she told the friend, "Thank you, but do not call right now. Just please stay on the phone for a minute and let me just do a quick investigation. Let me look out the windows, and just really make sure that this is nothing before you call the police." And so the friend said, "Okay, look around, but then I'm calling the police." And so with her phone and her gun in hand, Ada very carefully crept out from behind the couch, keeping a low profile, staying below the sight line of all the windows. And she crept from the living room into the kitchen towards the front of the house, and she walked over to the sink, and she very slowly raised her head until she could just barely peek through the window right above the sink that overlooked the front porch. Because remember, that was the last place she had heard sounds, from the front porch. And so she very carefully peeks and looks out the window, and there's nothing there. Nobody's on the porch. It's just empty, dark forest. She's safe. Ada let out a relieved half cry, half laugh, and then stood all the way up and felt totally ridiculous because clearly she had just imagined, all these people wandering around the outside of her house. And so she was about to tell her friend that, "Hey, sorry, there is no issue here. Don't call the police." But before she could get the words out, Ada happened to turn around and was looking back towards the living room, and she froze. Because there, in that same window she had heard those sounds coming from in the living room, was now the silhouettes of two men, clear as day, just looking in the window right at Ada. And so, acting purely on instinct, Ada just raised her gun and aimed it at these two men, and to her horror, the two men also raised guns and aimed them right back at Ada. And so Ada just started firing her gun at the window, and these men began shooting back at her, and right before Ada leapt to the ground, she was pretty sure she hit one of the men in the head with one of her rounds, and so she lands on the ground. It's absolute pandemonium at this point, and her friend, who's still on the phone, is screaming like, "What's going on? What's going on?" And all Ada could think to do was yell out, "There's two men, they're shooting at me, I think I shot one of them." And the friend is screaming, "I'm gonna call the police." And then the line goes dead, and Ada, who's crouched down behind the kitchen island at this point, she realizes all the shooting has stopped. It's now dead silent in the cabin. And so for a second, Ada was thinking to herself, maybe I managed to shoot both of them, and that's why it's quiet right now. But then another thought began to enter her head, that maybe she had only shot one of them, and the other survivor was moving into position to maybe ambush her. And so as she's running through what she's gonna do, she hears this horrible, loud thumping sound right above her in the second floor of the cabin. Now, Ada knew at this moment she should just get her dog and run. Because if this second shooter has survived and has now come into her cabin and is upstairs, that means the forest is now clear and she can make a run for it. But as she sat there by the island, still clutching her gun, in this beloved family cabin of hers, she began thinking about the fact that ever since that attack in Detroit over the summer, that had totally wrecked her life and made her scared of everything. And so as she heard the sound of whoever this was marching around in her second floor, she made a decision. She was going to stand her ground and fight. And so she took a deep breath, she stood up, and with gun in hand, she made her way to the stairs and began to go up. The police arrived at the cabin about 30 minutes later because Ada's friend did call the police, and she warned them that as far as she knew, there could be at least two gunmen there, and maybe Ada had shot one of them, she wasn't sure. And so when the police arrived, they showed up, guns drawn, and they walked up to the cabin and they searched the outside, but there was nobody out there, it was silent. And then when they made entry into the cabin, they saw clearly there had been a shootout. There were bullet holes all over the place, broken windows, but after searching the cabin top to bottom, they didn't find anybody. No Ada, no shooters. However, they did find Ada's terrified dog inside of the cabin, and the dog would be just fine. Now, once the cabin was secured of any threats, the police would do another comprehensive search looking for any evidence that would kind of tell them, where Ada or these shooters had gone. And during this secondary search, they would find Ada's shoes and her cell phone on the roof of the cabin, and they would also find her gun on the ground not far from the roof, suggesting maybe she had fallen off the roof or jumped from the roof, but they were kind of located roughly in the same area. And during this secondary search, they wouldn't find Ada or the gunman, but they would find Ada's cell phone and her shoes on the roof of the cabin, and they would also find Ada's gun on the ground not far from where her shoes and cell phone had been found. But that was it. Police immediately launched a massive search in the forest surrounding the cabin, but despite looking all over the place, they could not find any signs of Ada or her attackers. Police checked local hospitals to see if maybe the man that Ada had shot had shown up seeking medical attention, but as far as they could tell, he hadn't. And so pretty quickly, the police theorized that maybe there were no gunmen. Maybe what really happened here is Ada's boyfriend attacked her, and he was responsible for whatever happened to her. But when police checked on Ada's boyfriend, it would turn out he had a rock-solid alibi. He had been with Ada's adult son at the time Ada had gone missing, and Ada's own son said, yes, for sure, he was with me. He did not do this. But after that, the police thought, okay, well, maybe if Ada's boyfriend didn't do this, maybe he hired other people to hurt Ada. But there was no evidence of any strange financial transactions, and as far as they could tell when they did some digging, there was no strife in Ada and her boyfriend's relationship. So there was no clear reason why he would want to hurt her. And so that lead also kind of fell flat. Police would confirm that Ada was attacked that previous summer by this random guy in Detroit, and so for a little while they speculated that, maybe this guy, this attacker, who had never been caught, had maybe tracked Ada down to finish off the job. But that seemed so far-fetched and just unlikely that basically was shut down as well. And as the days passed, the evidence that was coming in only made the case more confusing. For example, there were all these bullets fired during this big shootout in the cabin, and when they examined the actual bullets they extracted from the walls and the floor and the ceiling, they were all from Ada's gun. However, outside and inside the cabin, they found all these different shell casings, suggesting that those bullets had been fired from different weapons, i.e., maybe the attacker's weapons. And so as the weeks passed by and Ada and her attackers were not found, people began to speculate that, maybe this was all an elaborate setup by Ada just so she could disappear. Or other people thought maybe she was abducted by aliens. I mean, there were lots of theories surrounding this, but basically nobody knew what happened. And then pretty soon, the case just went completely cold. That is, until December 21st, 2019, so about 2 months after Ada's disappearance. And on that day, Ada's family decided to drain a pond that was near that cabin in the woods. At this point, the family was so desperate for closure that they were prepared to do just about anything to find Ada and to figure out what happened to her. And so even though this pond had previously been searched by the police, they drained this pond, and sure enough, they find Ada. She was deceased, and her body was found about 300 yards away from the cabin, and she was covered in only about a foot of water. Now, initially, the speculation was, well, here you go, she must have been chased out of her cabin by these attackers, and she was shot and killed, and this is where she fell. But after a quick examination of her body, it was clear she had no bullet wounds on her anywhere. In fact, she didn't even have any bruises on her or any major scrapes or cuts or anything, so it didn't even seem like she had been in any sort of physical struggle at all before she died. In fact, unless she had drowned, it really just seemed totally unclear how she had died. It was not until the medical examiner did Ada's autopsy that all this baffling evidence began to make sense. It would turn out, in the wake of that horrible random attack that Ada had suffered over the summer, that Ada was actually doing far worse than she let on to her family and friends. She had basically begun to cope with her trauma and anxiety with substance abuse. And so on the night that she had died, she was likely feeling totally stressed out and anxious, and she couldn't sleep as a result. And so she had taken some Valium, which is a fairly strong sedative, and also some anti-anxiety medication. But after taking those pills, she still wasn't tired. And so that was when she decided to, go out for a walk with her dog, to clear her head, and have a smoke. But it was not cigarettes that she was smoking. She was smoking methamphetamine, known simply as meth. And meth is a very strong stimulant that people like because it makes them feel very strong and confident and alert, which for Ada was a powerful antidote to the helplessness she was feeling all the time from the attack she had suffered that summer. But one of the many downsides of meth is that it can make you extremely paranoid. And so during her walk that night, as she's smoking meth, she sees a mountain lion, which terrifies her. And then after the mountain lion trots off, it was like that jolt of adrenaline and fear from seeing the mountain lion didn't subside because of smoking meth. It was like the meth sent her into this paranoia overdrive that she couldn't escape from. And so when Ada went back inside of her cabin, she very likely did see people in her windows. But almost certainly it was just her own reflection. But again, she's in this meth-induced paranoid state. And so instead of realizing it was her own reflection, she thought it was like intruders coming to get her. And before long, she'd raised her gun and thought the people outside were raising their gun back at her. But again, it's just her reflection. And so when she was shooting, she was basically having a shootout with herself. And then as for, the strange noises she was hearing, like the footsteps on the second floor, very likely those were just natural sounds kind of happening outside. She's out in the middle of a forest. There's lots of noises that are totally natural at night. But again, she's in this paranoid state, and so she went upstairs to confront the person, and then didn't see anybody, and then police theorized that she must have, climbed out onto the roof to hide from these attackers, and then at some point, for reasons unknown, she leapt from the roof or climbed down or something, leaving behind her cell phone and shoes on the roof. She left her gun on the ground, and then she ran off into the forest, where she ultimately collapsed, 300 yards away in a foot of water, where she died not from drowning, but from a combination of hypothermia and also a toxic combination of drugs in her system. And so in the end, the danger that Ada was trying to escape was in her own mind.
On October 28, 2021, 25-year-old Mo Wilson climbed up onto her bike, pulled her dark goggles down over her eyes, put her feet on the pedals, and sped off down a dirt path in the West Texas town of Marfa. Mo leaned down a bit over her handlebars and adjusted her bike perfectly to the changing rocky terrain on the path. Pretty soon, she heard the tires of another bike grinding through the dirt and rocks right behind her, and when she turned and saw who it was, she broke out in a huge smile. It was a 34-year-old man named Colin Strickland, who was another rider, who pulled his bike right up alongside her, and the two of them started winding their way down the path together. So Mo and Colin were not just two bike riders out here enjoying a bike ride. They were actually both world-class professional gravel racers. This meant they competed against other cyclists from all over in races that took place on all kinds of different tracks. They would race through deserts, in the mountains, and over long distances down steep wooded paths. And the two of them had come here to Marfa, Texas, because it was home to great desert trails with difficult terrain that made it a perfect training ground for top riders like Mo and Colin. But after riding for a while, Mo looked out at the bright orange and red sunset stretching out across the huge West Texas sky, and she felt happy she'd come to Marfa, but for a reason that had nothing to do with her training. Because Marfa had gained a reputation as this perfect place for a romantic getaway. The small town had become home to upscale restaurants, high-end art galleries, and places to stay where visitors could feel like they were secluded from the rest of the world. And Mo was looking forward to being alone there with Colin. The two of them had met about a month earlier at a major gravel cycling race in Idaho. Colin was already considered one of the top male racers in the world, and he was actually a celebrity in the sport. And Mo was well on her way to becoming his counterpart, but in women's racing. Their shared love and commitment to the sport made it easy for them to get along right away. And so shortly after that race in Idaho, when Mo went home to Vermont and Colin went home to Austin, Texas, they started texting and speaking all the time on the phone. And just a few weeks later, Mo had headed to Austin to visit Colin, and at that point, they became romantically involved. Now, their relationship was still new, and Mo wasn't exactly sure where they stood, but she figured a few days alone together in Marfa would go a long way to bringing the two of them closer together. Out on the path, Mo and Colin kept on riding. And during this ride, each of them made sure to take the time and made the effort to hone specific skills that they needed to work on. As fun as this was, they were still very serious competitors, and they both had dreams of being the best in the sport, so they always had to train seriously. And they also both really wanted to serve as ambassadors for gravel racing, so it would continue to grow all over the world. Mo and Colin eventually finished up their training ride and then hopped off their bikes and began to stretch. They were both sweaty and a bit worn out, but now they could get all cleaned up and just spend some time together. And later that night, that's exactly what they did. They relaxed and talked in their room, and everything seemed easy between them. But as they were doing that, Colin got a text message, and Mo could see his whole attitude changed. He tensed up and got this annoyed look on his face and quickly responded to the text. Mo didn't want to press him, but she was pretty sure she knew who had just messaged Colin. Because Mo was aware that he had been seeing another woman, Caitlin Armstrong, before the two of them had started talking and texting. Colin said that he and Caitlin had split up, but it was clear to Mo that Caitlin had not gotten over him. After spending a few perfect days in Marfa, Mo tried hard not to worry too much about Caitlin. However, Mo wasn't naive. She didn't just have Caitlin to contend with. She also had the reality that, trying to maintain any kind of serious relationship with Colin was always going to be difficult. She lived in Vermont, and he lived 2,000 miles away in Texas, and in addition to that, they both traveled a ton for gravel racing competitions, and they didn't always compete at the same locations. So this was a big uphill battle from the start. But when it was time to leave Marfa and go their separate ways, Mo hoped that she and Colin had at least started something special enough that maybe could grow into something bigger in the future, even if they couldn't always be together in the same place. And by the time Mo finally got home to Vermont, she was already looking forward to the next time she could see Colin. At about 4:45 p.m. on May 11th, 2022, so a little more than 6 months after Mo's trip to Marfa, Mo wrapped her arms around Colin's waist on the back of his motorcycle as they sped down a road in Austin, Texas. The last 6 months had not gone exactly as Mo had hoped. After leaving Marfa, she and Colin had both been very busy, traveling and competing, like she knew they would be. But through the end of 2021 and the beginning of 2022, she felt like she and Colin had barely spoken. They texted occasionally, but their conversations really just seemed to be focused on gravel racing and competing. And so Mo began to think that maybe their romantic getaway together in Marfa had just been a one-time affair. But then, about a month ago in April, Mo had begun to hear from Colin a lot more. And he didn't just want to talk about racing. And when Mo had told Colin that she was headed to Austin in May to compete in a race and to spend some time with one of her best friends who lived there, Colin got excited and made it clear he was looking forward to seeing her. So now, on the back of Colin's motorcycle, Mo held on to him a bit tighter as he turned off a main road onto a side street. they whipped through a heavily wooded area, past an artificial lake, and into the parking lot of Deep Eddy Pool, a popular public swimming pool in Austin. Mo and Colin hopped off the motorcycle and went inside. Mo took off her shoes and her cover-up that was over her bathing suit, and she dove right in. And while Mo didn't want to force anything, she was already starting to feel like she and Colin had reconnected here since she'd arrived. So they would spend hours just swimming and talking in the pool, having a great time, and then afterwards they climbed out, got dressed, and then went and got dinner together nearby. A little after 8:30 p.m. that same night, Colin dropped Mo off at her friend's place where she was staying. They said they would see each other at the upcoming race, and then Mo climbed off Colin's motorcycle. She smiled and waved as she walked around the building into the alley. Then she headed up the old wooden staircase that led from the alley to her friend's small second-floor garage apartment. Once inside, Mo checked on her gravel bike that she'd brought with her just to make sure it was ready to go. Once she was satisfied that it was in good shape, she headed to the bathroom to take a shower. But before she could ever turn the water on, she heard the sound of the apartment door opening. About an hour and a half later, so a few minutes before 10 p.m., Mo's friend walked into the apartment and called out for Mo. The friend didn't get a response, and so initially, she thought maybe Mo was still out with Colin. But as she walked further into the apartment, she saw Mo's legs sticking out from the bathroom. And the friend actually smiled, because she knew that sometimes, after a long day of bike riding, Mo liked to stretch out on the cool bathroom floor to recuperate, especially if it was really hot outside, and it had been over 90 degrees Fahrenheit most of that day. So she called Mo's name again, but Mo still didn't say anything. So her friend walked down the hall, and when she got to the bathroom and actually saw Mo, she began to scream, because the bathroom wall and floor were spattered with blood. Mo's friend grabbed her phone and dialed 911, and as soon as she heard the operator, she shouted that her friend was covered in blood and unconscious. The operator said he would send first responders right away, but he also began telling Mo's friend how to perform CPR. And so the friend dropped down and started doing chest compressions on Mo, fighting through tears and begging Mo to wake up, but nothing was working. Within minutes, Mo's friend heard the door open, and a first responder quickly rushed to the bathroom. The friend at this point backed away, and the first responder took over CPR. But it was too late. Mo was pronounced dead at the scene. Late that night, Detective Richard Spittler and Detective Katie Connor of the Austin Police Department walked through the alleyway and up the steps to the second-floor apartment. On their way, they passed by a uniformed police officer who was standing with a young woman who couldn't stop crying. Spittler and Connor passed them and then put on their gloves, stepped inside the apartment, and walked past a few more officers who'd also arrived before them. Spittler and Connor knew that Anna Mariah Wilson, a woman in her 20s nicknamed Mo, who'd been visiting from out of state, had been pronounced dead at her friend's apartment, but they really didn't know much more than that. But as soon as they stepped into the doorway of the bathroom, they had a pretty good idea about what had happened. Mo had 3 gunshot wounds in her chest, and amidst the blood surrounding her body, they saw 9mm bullet casings. With all the blood on the walls, the floor, and the body, the detectives knew that the forensics team would have plenty of samples to take, and they thought they already had a pretty clear picture of what had happened to Mo. So, they stepped away from the bathroom and just did a sweep of the apartment. It didn't look like the place had been ransacked in any way, and as far as they could tell, it didn't look like this had been a robbery gone wrong, because expensive electronic equipment had been left untouched. But they still didn't want to jump to any conclusions until they talked to the person who actually lived there. So as the forensics team arrived and got to work, Spittler also sent other officers to canvass the apartment complex and the surrounding area. And then once they were dispatched, he and Detective Connor headed downstairs towards the alley. There, they found the woman who was still crying, and it would turn out she was the owner of the apartment and was Mo's friend. Both detectives felt bad for her, and they knew she'd actually performed CPR on her friend to try to revive her. But right now, despite how much trauma this woman had been through, she was still the only direct link they had to the crime scene. She'd found the victim, and she'd made the 911 call. So, as gently as he could, Spittler told Mo's friend that she would have to come with them to the station for questioning. As the night of May 11th turned into the morning of May 12th, Detective Spittler and Connor sat across from Mo's friend inside of an interview room at the station. The woman was still visibly upset, so the detectives did their best to keep her calm and let her know they were just trying to get a clear picture of what had happened that night. And eventually, Mo's friend began to talk, and she told the detectives that she had found Mo in the bathroom after coming home. And she said that when she had come to her apartment that night, she hadn't heard or seen anything strange outside when she parked her car or when she was walking up the steps. Everything seemed normal. Spittler asked her if she had noticed if anything inside of her apartment appeared to have been stolen. Mo's friend thought about it and then said nothing of hers had been taken. However, Mo's very expensive specialty gravel racing bicycle was gone, and she said there was no way that Mo would have taken it somewhere and just left it. Because Mo not only loved that bike, but literally needed it for an upcoming race. The detectives shared a look. They both realized this could mean that Mo's murder had been the result of a robbery gone wrong. But since the expensive bike was the only thing taken, Spittler thought that most likely pointed to someone who would have known Mo was in town and that she'd brought her bike with her. So Spittler asked if anybody else knew that Mo was staying at the apartment and that she might have brought her bike. And Mo's friend said that actually a bunch of people knew, because Mo was a big-time gravel racer, and a large number of cyclists who knew her were in town to compete at an upcoming race. But Mo's friend did quickly add that the only person she knew Mo had seen that day was a cyclist that Mo had an on-again, off-again relationship with, a guy who was famous in gravel racing circles named Colin Strickland. Several hours later, still on the morning of May 12th, Detective Spittler and several other officers drove towards Colin Strickland's house in Austin. After working through the night, Spittler and Connor had begun to believe that the man Mo had been out with the day before was their only legitimate lead. They'd taken DNA samples from Mo's friend who'd found Mo, and while they weren't willing to write anyone off yet as a suspect, neither detective really believed she was the killer. On top of that, the detectives' early theory that Mo's murder could have been a robbery gone wrong had already taken a significant hit. Because as officers had canvassed the surrounding area, they'd found Mo's missing bike, abandoned in a thick growth of bamboo, less than 70 feet away from the apartment where Mo had been killed. The one other piece of possible evidence they'd found had come from video doorbell footage from an apartment near the crime scene that showed a black Jeep Cherokee with a large bike rack driving towards Mo's friend's place not long before Mo had most likely been killed. But the police couldn't get a clear read on the license plate number or a clear look at the driver. So, while Detective Connor stayed behind at the station and tried to track down the Jeep, Spittler and his team pulled up their cars to Colin Strickland's house. And when Spittler glanced out of his window, he almost wanted to laugh because he couldn't believe his luck. Parked right out in front of the house was a black Jeep Cherokee with a large bike rack, just like the one in the video footage. The sight of the Jeep gave Spittler a rush, and he thought this was almost too good to be true. But he didn't want Colin to panic and do something stupid. And as much as this car made it seem like there was a good chance Spittler had just found his killer, he did not want to rush to judgment. So when Colin opened the door calmly and said he was willing to speak to the police, Spittler played everything very close to the vest. And so he started his interview with the most basic questions he could think of. He asked Colin if he knew a woman who was a professional cyclist named Anna, and Colin said no, he didn't know anybody by that name. And this actually blew Spittler away, because it was such a blatant lie that Spittler easily could have refuted, even if he hadn't already heard from her friend that Colin and Mo had a close relationship. In fact, in less than a day, Spittler and his team had found online references to Colin and Mo being at multiple races across the country at the same time. And it was also clear to Spittler that the world of professional gravel racing was a pretty small one. So there was no logical way that one of the top racers on the men's side never would have come across one of the top racers on the women's side. But Spittler didn't show any of that on his face. Instead, he told Colin the woman in question, Anna, had the last name of Wilson and was a gravel rider. And at this, Colin's face suddenly changed, like he was only just now remembering Mo's given name, Anna. And he said, actually, yeah, I do know her. Then the detective told Colin that, well, Mo had died the night before, and now Colin's expression changed again. He leaned over and just started rubbing his face and neck. Spittler didn't know what to make of this. Colin did look upset, but at the same time, he had just acted like he didn't know who Anna was, as if he literally didn't know that the woman he had been intimate with, Mo, that her actual first name was Anna, I mean, I guess it was possible, but realistically, if you're being intimate with this person, you probably know their real first name. But maybe he forgot. But it was just all very suspicious. So, after a moment, Spittler told Colin they would need to take him to the station for further questioning. Spittler knew he didn't have anything to hold Colin on yet, but he didn't want to risk Colin fleeing, and he needed more time because he wanted to get a search warrant for Colin's house. As they walked outside together, Spittler asked Colin if the black Jeep Cherokee belonged to him, and Colin said no, it belonged to his girlfriend who lived with him, Caitlin Armstrong. So Spittler asked if Colin ever drove it, and Colin laughed and said no, wasn't really his style. He said he liked to drive motorcycles and big diesel trucks. Spittler smiled and nodded like it was no big deal, but deep down he knew that Colin could easily be lying here. I mean, it was just as likely that, he was at Mo's friend's house the night before, driving that Jeep Cherokee. But right now, it was Colin's word against his. After a short drive, Detective Spittler arrived at the station. While his suspect, Colin Strickland, was taken to an interview room, Spittler told his partner, Detective Connor, about how he'd found the black Jeep with the bike rack on it. It was Colin's live-in girlfriend's car, Caitlin Armstrong. And Detective Connor seemed shocked, not because she was surprised about the Jeep, but because she'd also discovered something huge about Caitlin. While she and the rest of the team were searching for the Jeep and, naturally digging into Colin Strickland's background because he was someone who was seeing Mo, they had discovered his and Caitlin's relationship. And a quick search of a police database showed that police had an outstanding arrest warrant for Caitlin. Because years earlier, Caitlin had gone in to get Botox done at a place in town, and she had agreed to pay for it, she got the services done, but then at the end, when she was actually told to cough up the money, $650, she had run out without paying. Spittler could barely contain his excitement, because this meant they could bring Caitlin in and hold her on that warrant, even if they didn't have enough evidence to hold her in Mo's murder case yet. And that just meant they would have more time to look into her possible connection to the murder. Or at the very least, they would have leverage on her. And if she maybe knew something about her boyfriend, Colin Strickland's potential involvement in Mo's murder, she might be more willing to give up that information. As the detectives talked, they found it hard to believe how quickly things were coming together. In the course of just a single day, they'd already moved in on 2 primary suspects, and it really looked like the doorbell camera footage of the Jeep, along with all the ample circumstantial evidence, pointed to one or both of these people. Shortly after that, officers were able to track down Caitlin at work. They brought her into the station, and at that point, the detectives split up. Spittler continued his conversation with Colin that they had started back at the house, while Caitlin was brought to a separate interview room to sit down with Detective Connor. By this point, Caitlin knew about Mo's death, so Detective Connor didn't waste any time. She went right after Caitlin about her Jeep. Connor said they had footage that showed Caitlin's car driving right near Mo's friend's apartment soon before the murder took place. But Caitlin proved to be very calm and cooperative. She didn't deny that she'd been driving in the area where Mo had been murdered, but she said she had nothing to do with Mo's death. Still, she couldn't really provide the detective with any real reason why she had just happened to be right by the apartment at that time. And while Caitlin never lost her cool, Connor did notice a change in her voice and body language when the subject of Mo's relationship with her boyfriend came up. Caitlin started to sound like a jealous girlfriend. She began talking about how she and Colin had broken up for a short period of time, and it was during that time that Colin apparently had begun seeing Mo a little bit, and it just clearly rattled Caitlin. And by the end of the interview, Detective Connor flat out told Caitlin that the evidence did not make things look good for her, and Caitlin just sort of nodded in agreement. And Detective Connor didn't really know what to make of it. Caitlin didn't confess to anything, but also didn't really defend herself. She just kind of accepted that she was being looked at seriously as a suspect in a murder case, and didn't really put up much of a defense. And while the Jeep footage was pretty damning on its own, realistically, it was not clear in the video who was driving. But by this point, Connor believed if she and Spittler could secure even just one more piece of evidence to connect Caitlin to the crime scene, in addition to the Jeep, that would be more than enough to arrest her for Mo's murder. In the days following the interviews with Caitlin and Colin, police did obtain a search warrant for their house. And inside the house, they found 2 9mm pistols, which matched the type of bullet casing found at the crime scene. Now, all they had to do was wait a few days for the ballistics report to come in to see if one or even both of those guns had fired the rounds that killed Mo. On May 14th, so 3 days after Mo's death, the race that she had actually come to Austin to take part in went ahead as scheduled. But the race quickly turned into a kind of memorial for Mo. For the opening portion of the race, the riders all rode slowly and stayed together in a pack, placing their hands on each other's backs, while others openly sobbed on the course. And when the winner on the men's side of the race crossed the finish line, he didn't celebrate. Instead, he took off his helmet and bowed his head. He would later post on Instagram, quote, "A normal victory salute was inappropriate on a day like this." But as riders from all across the country used that race in Austin as a way to honor and celebrate the life of Mo Wilson, a person most of them considered a friend who they loved and respected, there was one rider whose absence seemed to cast a shadow over everything. Colin Strickland, one of the most popular competitors in the world, and someone who people clearly saw had a relationship with Mo, even if it was just a friendly one, had not shown up. And 3 days later, on May 17th, the detectives read over the ballistics report at the station, and as they did, both of their faces lit up. Because it was clear in the report that one of the guns found in Colin and Caitlin's house was the murder weapon. Following that ballistics report, Spittler and Connor felt a mix of excitement and relief. They believed that in less than a week, they had basically cracked Mo Wilson's murder case. They still weren't sure if either Colin or his girlfriend Caitlin had acted alone, or if maybe they had killed Mo together. But they felt confident they now had more than enough evidence to charge them both. The murder weapon had been found in their house, and police had footage of Caitlin's black Jeep driving near Mo's friend's apartment soon before the murder took place. And in addition to that concrete evidence, the detectives had also caught Colin in what appeared to be a lie. When he was first approached about who Anna was, he said he didn't know who she was. But then when they mentioned that her nickname was Mo, Colin was like, "Oh, now I know who it is." But it's like, you were in a relationship with her. You had to know what her first name was. So there was that. And then also the fact that Caitlin, in her interview, seemed very much like a jealous girlfriend whenever Mo came up. And then finally, detectives had conducted interviews of people in the gravel racing community who spoke openly about the potential love triangle between the victim and the two suspects. So, as far as Connor or Spittler were concerned, either one or both of their suspects would soon be going away to prison for a very long time. But before Spittler and Connor were able to wrap up everything and hand the case over to the district attorney, their investigation, which had been incredibly straightforward so far, took a bizarre turn that neither of them saw coming. In late June, about a month after Mo's murder, Austin police got word from a small group of United States Marshals who were working in Costa Rica. The Marshals told the detectives that they were on the trail of a fugitive named Ari Martin, and they believed that Ari was involved in the murder of Mo Wilson. On the morning of Wednesday, June 29th, 2022, over a month and a half after Mo's death, U.S. Marshal Amir Perez walked down the street in a small coastal town called Santa Teresa in Costa Rica, dressed in a Hawaiian shirt, like a tourist. Perez and his small band of marshals had been desperately trying to track down the wanted American fugitive named Ari Martin for over a month. They had spent the last week here in this touristy town, with bars and shops and yoga studios. Right now, Perez was holding up his cell phone with a picture of Ari pulled up on the screen, and he was checking the face of every woman that passed by him to look for a resemblance. But he was having a bizarre problem, and that was that a lot of the women he passed looked like Ari Martin. So Ari was an attractive woman, but she was strangely generic looking, with no unique features really at all. And so this made her somewhat forgettable for the people that interacted with her. And it also made it very hard to pick her out of a crowd, because basically in any crowd, there were at least 3 other women who sort of looked like her. But today, Perez was not just canvassing. He was on his way to a specific location, a cheap hostel he was hoping Ari might be staying at. And after a half-a-block walk, he found it. He turned off the sidewalk and walked inside the building. Then, pretending to be a tourist looking to meet someone, he walked through the hostel out onto a back patio where there were several tables and people were sitting and talking and drinking. and sitting at one of these tables, Perez saw a generic-looking woman who was speaking English. Perez started to get excited, and he looked down at the photo on his phone, but he still couldn't quite tell if this woman was actually a match. He needed to get closer to be sure. So Perez approached the table, he smiled, and began speaking in Spanish. And at this point, the generic-looking American looked up and smiled at him. And while the smile was, like the rest of her, sort of unremarkable, Perez saw one marking that none of the other women he'd looked at had possessed. And what it was a bandage across this woman's nose. And at this point, Perez knew he had found Ari Martin. With more help from Costa Rican authorities, Perez and his team would soon get Ari back to America. And in Austin, Texas, Detective Spittler and Connor would get to sit down with Ari. And through their conversation, they would learn exactly what had happened to Mo Wilson, and they would finally be able to close one of the strangest murder cases any of them had ever worked. Based on information provided by the fugitive Ari Martin, evidence found in the United States and Costa Rica, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is what police believe happened to Mo Wilson on the night she was killed, May 11th, 2022. That night, around 9:15 p.m., the killer walked through the alley and climbed the steps up to the second-floor apartment. The killer thought being in the alley would keep them mostly out of sight, but they still wore all black just to be safe. Even though the sun had set, it was still very hot outside, and the killer could feel sweat dripping down their face. They used their sleeve to wipe their face, then they drew a 9mm pistol from their waistband and opened the door. As slowly and quietly as they could, the killer walked into the apartment and made their way down the hall. At some point, they stopped and looked over at the high-end gravel racing bike leaning up against the wall. Eventually, they kept on moving down the hall, and as they did, they heard something coming from the bathroom. They stopped and looked over at the bathroom door, and they saw light coming out from underneath. Clearly, somebody was in there. At this point, the killer grabbed their gun tightly and took a few more steps until they were stopped right in front of the bathroom door. There, they took a steadying breath, raised their gun, then reached out with their offhand and opened up the door. Inside the bathroom, Mo saw their killer and she screamed, but before Mo could do anything, the killer fired off 2 shots from their pistol. The bullet struck Mo directly in the chest, and she fell to the floor on her back as blood spattered the walls. The killer walked over and just stood over Mo, staring down for a few seconds, seeing all this blood run from her wounds onto the ground. Then, the killer raised their gun again, aimed it at Mo's chest, and fired for a 3rd time. After that, Mo lay motionless on the bathroom floor. For a few moments, the killer just stood there, staring down at Mo, trying to make sure she really was dead. And when she continued to lay there motionless, the killer felt confident she was. So, they turned around and headed back into the hallway. There, they grabbed Mo's expensive bike that was leaning up against the wall, and with it in hand, they moved as quickly as they could back towards the door. The bike was cumbersome to move, but the killer managed to handle the outside stairs quickly and rushed into the alley with the bike. Then they ran through the darkness to a spot they knew was covered with a thick growth of bamboo. The killer then tossed Mo's bike into the bamboo, hoping it would hide it and convince the police that Mo had been killed for her expensive bike. Once the bike had been ditched, the killer took a deep breath, then ran out of the alley and hopped into the black Jeep Cherokee that was parked nearby. Once in the car, they hit the gas and sped away across town. From the beginning, Mo's murder had seemed pretty straightforward to Spittler and Connor. But it was in the days following the interviews with their main suspects, Colin Strickland and his girlfriend Caitlin Armstrong, that had sent their investigation down a path the detectives never could have predicted. Because before any arrests could be made, the detectives discovered that Mo's killer had actually fled Austin. And it was not until a month later, when the U.S. Marshals conducted their search in Costa Rica for the fugitive Ari Martin, that everything would finally come together. Because when U.S. Marshal Amir Perez found Ari at the hostel in the small coastal town, he knew he was actually looking at Mo's killer, who was none other than Caitlin Armstrong herself. Here's what happened. During Caitlin's interview with Detective Connor, Police had wanted to hold Caitlin on the arrest warrant that had been issued when she ran out on a bill for $650, which had been for that Botox treatment. But it would turn out that arrest warrant apparently had listed Caitlin's date of birth incorrectly, and so it was deemed invalid, and Caitlin was released from jail that very day. And in the time between her release and when the police got the ballistics report back from the guns found in Caitlin and Colin's house, Caitlin moved fast. She immediately sold her Jeep and used some of that money to quickly get out of Texas and head north to Newark, New Jersey. She wiped all of her social media accounts, got rid of her cell phone, and then flew from Newark to Costa Rica. And once she'd made it to Costa Rica, she began going by several different pseudonyms before landing on Ari Martin. Once police discovered Caitlin had made a run for it, they were more convinced than ever that she was the killer. But finding her proved to be very difficult. And this was because Caitlin had not just changed her name, she also went ahead and changed her face. She'd gotten plastic surgery to intentionally erase her individuality and make her look like lots of other women. But while the surgery did make her look somewhat generic, it also left her with a bandage over her nose. And that's how U.S. Marshal Perez finally identified her. The marshals brought Caitlin back to Austin, and there she eventually confessed to murdering Mo. Colin Strickland was not involved in any way with Mo's murder. Caitlin Armstrong was convicted of murder and sentenced to 90 years in prison with a chance for parole in 2053.
On the morning of April 30th, 1943, a fisherman named Jose Antonio Rey Maria rowed his little boat out into the rough waters of the Atlantic Ocean just off the coast of Spain. Jose was a sardine spotter, which meant his job was to go out into the ocean and look down and try to find schools of sardines swimming about 20 feet below the surface, and then he would flag the other fishermen over who would scoop the fish up with their nets. And Jose was very good at his job. In fact, he was quite possibly the best sardine spotter in the whole village of Punta Umbria, which is a small fishing village in southwestern Spain where Jose was from. But on this particular day, the weather wasn't quite great, the water was kind of murky and choppy, and so Jose wasn't seeing any sardines. But as Jose was starting to feel frustrated, he looked out, and on the surface of the water, pretty far away from him, he saw this strange object floating on the surface. And at first, he assumed it had to be maybe some dead sea animal that had floated to the surface. But as he stared at it from his boat that was rocking in the water, he saw between waves, there was a yellow color on this lump that just looked kind of unnatural. And so feeling curious about whatever this was, Jose decided to start rowing over in that direction and get a better look. And as he got closer and closer, he realized that yellow color was unnatural. The yellow was part of a life jacket, which meant this was a person floating in the ocean. And so Jose, with his heart now racing, was thinking, oh my gosh, I have to go save this person. And so he raced over right up alongside them, and as soon as he looked down, he realized it was obviously too late. This person was obviously deceased. It was a man who had a military trench coat on who was lying face down in the water. And so Jose reached into the water and rolled the guy over, and immediately he was hit with this horrible smell, and then he looked at the face of this dead person and he was horrified. The guy's eyes were sunken into his skull, he had mold growing on his chin, bones were exposed, and it almost looked like the dead guy's face was trapped in this kind of ghastly expression, as if the last thing he experienced was horrifying before he died. And then Jose noticed there was something else about this corpse. There was a chain wrapped around his wrist, and that chain extended deep into the water. And so Jose grabbed the chain and began reeling it back in, and eventually he pulled out this big black briefcase that had a code on the top of it that you would need to enter in order to open it. Now, for context, at this time in Europe, World War II was raging from Britain to Russia. And so there were literally thousands of dead corpses scattered all over the world, basically, around the areas where fighting was taking place. So at this time, finding a dead soldier floating out in the middle of the ocean was actually not that uncommon. But in Spain, where Jose was,
this was uncommon because Spain had not entered World War II. They were a neutral country. And so because there was no fighting happening there should not have been any dead soldiers floating just off their coastline. And so Jose stared transfixed at this dead soldier in his briefcase for a couple more moments, and then he kind of broke out of it and turned and yelled to the other fishermen who were out there in another boat and tried to flag them over to help get this corpse out of the water. But the other fishermen, when they realized what Jose was asking them to do, they said, no, we're not helping you with that. We're not touching the dead body. And so Jose just grabbed the dead body with one arm, and then awkwardly with his other arm, he managed to row this boat and drag along this corpse all the way back to the beach. And as he did, he and the other fishermen were kind of yelling back and forth at each other. It was kind of a commotion on the water. And so by the time Jose had got the corpse back to shore and dragged it up onto the sand, villagers in Punta Umbria had heard the commotion and come outside to see what was going on. And they saw Jose standing there with this dead body. And so they began forming a crowd around the body. And so nearby, Spanish soldiers were doing a training exercise, and they saw this crowd gathering on the beach, and so a group of them walked over to see what was going on, and they pushed through the crowd and they saw this dead body on the ground, and right away they began searching the dead body to figure out who it was. And when the Spanish soldiers found his identification papers, they learned that his name was William Martin, and he was a major in the British Royal Marines. Also on these papers, it said that Major Martin was assigned to the Combined Operation Headquarters in London, which the Spanish soldiers knew was an outpost that organized commando raids on Nazi-held territory. Under Major Martin's military trench coat, when the soldiers opened it up, they saw he was dressed in full kit, full battle gear, which suggested he had died during one of these commando raids. But after the Spanish soldiers had removed his gear, they couldn't find any shrapnel wounds or gunshot wounds. And so the running theory was, he must have been flying over this area and maybe his plane was shot down, and that's why we can't figure out how he died. But the Spanish soldiers had not heard any reports of a plane being shot down right off the coast. And so really they had no idea how Major Martin actually came to be here. Then one of these Spanish soldiers who was still searching Major Martin's pockets found in one of them some crumpled papers and a photograph. And after he looked at them, he tapped on his commanding officer's shoulder and showed him. The photo was black and white, and it was this pretty young woman, and on the back of it, it was signed Pam. As for the crumpled papers that had been near this photo, they were bills. One was from a London nightclub from 3 nights earlier, and the other was a receipt for a diamond engagement ring. Now, these Spanish soldiers were not overly emotional, but they couldn't help but think how kind of sad it was that, Major Martin obviously was in love with this woman Pam, and they must have just gotten engaged, and now he's dead. It's like a tragic love story. And so the soldier who had found these bills and this photo folded them back up and tucked them back inside of Major Martin's pockets, and then the soldiers talked about what they should do next. Now, technically, because Spain was a neutral country, what they were supposed to do was turn this body back over to the British because he was a British soldier. But the Spanish government was run by a fascist dictator, Francisco Franco, who was not really neutral at all. He was actually secretly aligned with the Nazis. In fact, the Nazis' leader, Adolf Hitler, had helped Franco come to power, and so now that he was in power, he regularly shared secrets with the Germans. And so when these Spanish soldiers eventually contacted their higher-ups to ask what to do with this dead British soldier, their superiors told them, do not give Major Martin's body back to the British. Instead, bring his body to a nearby morgue where agents who worked for Franco would be able to inspect the body and open up that briefcase and see what was inside. And so these Spanish soldiers did as they were told. And when Franco's agents were able to finally pop open that black briefcase that was connected to Major Martin's wrist, they discovered inside 3 letters from leaders of the British military. And when Franco's agents read these letters, they knew right away they had discovered something incredible. And within days, these letters were sitting right on Adolf Hitler's desk. Now, at this time, in April of 1943, Hitler was starting to worry that he was about to lose the war. Even though the Nazis had successfully conquered most of Europe, it felt like the tide was turning against them. And in Hitler's mind, it was starting to seem likely that the Americans and the British were poised to launch some sort of massive attack on Nazi-controlled territory, and if they weren't ready for it, this could cost them the war. But Hitler had no idea where this major Allied attack was going to happen. And so trying to figure that out was basically the biggest priority the Nazis had at the time. Now, most of Hitler's intelligence suggested that this big major Allied attack was going to take place on Sicily, which is an Italian island. Italy was allied with the Nazis, and Nazi spies who were monitoring British and American phone conversations were hearing lots of chatter about an invasion of Sicily, and so that's why they believed that's got to be the place. That's where the attack's going to happen. But when Hitler looked at these 3 letters that were found inside of Major Martin's briefcase, everything changed. The letters, which were all signed by top leaders of the British military, said that the plans to attack Sicily were actually fake, that British and American forces were talking on these obviously tapped phone lines. They knew the Nazis were listening. They were talking on these lines about this invasion of Sicily just to confuse the Nazis. They wanted the Nazis to think that Sicily is the place. But, as these letters would go on to explain, the real place, the real location of this huge Allied attack was going to be Nazi-controlled Greece, so 500 miles away. And so as Hitler is reading this, he's terrified because in his mind, he always thought Greece was really the Nazis' weakest link. And so to get this intelligence, it was the equivalent of like winning the lottery. Suddenly, Hitler went from having no idea where this huge attack on him was going to be to knowing exactly where it was going to be and knowing that he would have the time to shore up his weakest link, Greece. And so, on May 12th, 1943, less than 2 weeks after Jose the sardine spotter found Major Martin's body floating off the coast of Punta Umbria, Hitler sent a military directive to all of his leaders to prepare for a huge Allied attack, not on Sicily, but on Greece. And before long, German tanks were rumbling from southern France to Greece, and tens of thousands of German soldiers were setting up barriers on Greek beaches to repel the invasion. And then out at sea, the famous German U-boats, their submarines, which were so deadly during World War II, were out all over the place, getting ready to shoot any Allied ships that came towards the shore. In short, the Nazis were ready. But by July 9th, so 2 months later, nothing had happened. There had been no major Allied attack on Greece, on Sicily, or anywhere else for that matter. Meanwhile, back in Sicily on July 9th, one of the few soldiers who was still stationed there, because remember, all those soldiers had been pushed to Greece, one of the few remaining soldiers was in his bunk writing a letter to his mother, and he would detail that it just felt too quiet in Sicily. And after he had written this letter, signed it, and put it away, he heard outside a massive booming sound. And so he ran outside and he looked in horror towards the horizon. Now, instead of being a beautiful, clear blue, it was black with smoke and warships as far as the eye could see. He couldn't even count the number of warships on the horizon. And they were all coming right towards Sicily, firing their cannons and guns. This was the big Allied attack. It was on Sicily. The few soldiers in Sicily who came out of their bunkers and looked out and saw this knew right away that they were so ridiculously outnumbered that there was absolutely no hope. And so the soldier who had just written to his mother about how calm it seemed here, along with several others who was standing near him, they immediately just took off their uniforms and ran. And soon the other soldiers on the island began coming out of their cover and seeing they were under attack, and most of them did the same thing. Everybody basically ran away. And so the British and the Americans that were coming on warships barely had to fight. They took over Sicily incredibly easily, and within a few weeks, the Allies had complete control over the island, and the Italian government had been overthrown. Hitler had thought this secret intelligence he had found inside of Major Martin's briefcase would help him win the war. But in reality, those letters actually proved to be the beginning of the end for the Nazis. It would turn out Major William Martin, the dead British soldier that Jose the sardine spotter found off the coast of Punta Umbria, Spain, was not really who he appeared to be. In reality, Major William Martin didn't exist. The body definitely existed. That was a real dead body, but the identification of the body was fake. It had been fabricated by two very smart British intelligence officers named Ewan Montague and Charles Chumley as part of their very famous operation called Operation Mincemeat. And this operation was truly one of a kind. It was designed entirely to trick Hitler. The Allies knew if they dropped a dead British soldier off the coast of Spain, a neutral country, that they would turn it over to the Germans. And that's exactly what happened. And so everything that was on the fake Major's body, from the trench coat to the kit he was wearing to the identification papers, the receipts, the photos, all of it was placed very intentionally to convince the Germans that Major Martin was real. Major Martin was given a high enough military rank that it kind of made sense that he might be carrying this really special briefcase with highly classified military secrets, but his rank was not high enough that he would be known in military circles, because that would make it too easy for the Germans to identify that this was fake. And for the same reason, Montague and Chumley gave their fake major a very common name, Bill Martin. There were loads of Martins in the British military at the time, making a fake one hard to spot. But the British intelligence officers knew that they couldn't just present this kind of basic, generic British soldier and trick the entire German military. They needed to give him a backstory. And so Chumley and Montague spent as much time on Major Martin's uniform and what he was wearing as they did on his fake love affair with Pam. Montague and Chumley had a woman on their staff write these phony love letters to Major Martin, pretending to be Pam, and she wrote in beautiful curling penmanship, talking about how difficult it was to be in love with him during a war. And then also Chumley and Montague got that receipt for the diamond engagement ring, along with the nightclub receipt from just a couple of days earlier, and they tucked that into his pocket, really making it feel like this tragic love story. And so it was a combination of all of these details that had been thought through so carefully by these intelligence officers that really made Major Martin seem 100% real. As for the real identification of the dead body, it belonged to a 34-year-old homeless man from London named Glendor Michael. Michael had lived this wretched, miserable life and then eventually died when he ate rat poison that was on a piece of bread. We don't know if he tried to kill himself or if it was accidental. Michael's body had been stored in a refrigerator in a morgue unclaimed for months when Montague and Chumley found out about him and decided he would be perfect because no one would notice if his body went missing. And so ultimately, Operation Mincemeat was a massive success. Hitler completely mistook a homeless man from London for a relatively high-ranking British military officer carrying international secrets on his wrist, and it cost Hitler the war. Glendor Michael may have lived a wretched life and died in absolute agony, but in death, he helped defeat the Nazis. Today, there is a marker on Glendor Michael's grave in Spain that actually denotes him as an official British military officer. As for Montague and Chumley, they were quickly promoted after Operation Mincemeat and then ultimately became famous for their plot. On the night of February 12th, 2017, a young woman named Sidi Aisha saw something coming over to her that surprised her so much that she gasped and she put her drink down on the bar. The bar she was at was called the Hard Rock Cafe in Kuala Lumpur, which is the capital city of Malaysia. This night for Sidi had already been one of the best in recent memory, but now it was getting even better because a waitress was walking over to her carrying a birthday cake with a candle lit in the middle, and Sidi knew it was for her. So she stepped forward kind of bashfully, and all of Sidi's friends who were there with her kind of formed up around her, and as the waitress came over to Sidi, the friends all immediately began singing happy birthday to Sidi. It was City's 25th birthday, and she could not believe how far she had come. Here she was in this beautiful American-styled restaurant, surrounded by her friends, who were these big TV show producers, and tonight they were throwing a party for her, something that did not happen often in City's life to this point. After City's friends finished singing happy birthday, City leaned forward and she blew out her candle, but she didn't even make a wish before she blew it out, because to her, she felt like she had everything she had ever wanted. And so instead, as she blew that candle out, she just made a point to feel incredibly grateful for the life that she now had. Because not long ago, City's life looked very different. City had grown up in a tiny town inside of a jungle in Indonesia. She was the youngest of 3 children, and her parents were very poor farmers that barely made enough money to provide shelter and food for their kids. In fact, City's parents were so poor that they couldn't afford to send her to high school. They needed her to stay home and go to work to help support the family. City would end up getting married, and she would have a son with her husband, but her husband would divorce her and not provide any support for their kid. And so suddenly City was the single mother trying to look out for her son while also trying to provide for her parents and her other siblings. And eventually it became so difficult to find enough work to provide for all these people that City was forced to go abroad and look for work elsewhere outside of Indonesia, which meant she had to leave behind not only her parents and siblings, but also her son. Her son had to stay with her parents. City would ultimately find work as a masseuse in a hotel in Malaysia called the Flamingo. Now, City really did not like this work at all, but it paid well enough and she needed the money badly enough that she decided to just keep on doing it. Sometimes City, like a lot of the other girls that she worked with at the hotel, would daydream about being discovered as a model or a singer or an actress and getting taken away from this life to a life of luxury and wealth and leisure. But City never really expected that to happen. Next to City at the bar was her producer, whose name was James. And James had his arm around her, and he suddenly flashed her his cell phone, and he kind of pointed to the screen. And City looked at it, and she saw there was a text message from someone, but it was in a language that she didn't recognize. And she asked James, what is that? And James grinned at her and said, "This is my boss telling me that you are already a superstar in Korea." And when City heard this, she was totally embarrassed, but also really excited. City had met James about a month ago in January of 2017 when City and some of her friends from the hotel had decided to go out for the night. Now, City very rarely went out. She basically worked and slept and then sent home her money to her family. But for whatever reason, she had been convinced by her friends to go out and have a good time. And so she was all dolled up and she and her friends were standing in line to get into a bar when a very handsome man wearing a suit, James, walked up to City and said, "Have you done any acting?" And City, wearing her best clothes with her friends, she suddenly felt bold. And she told this guy, who she didn't know, that, "No, I haven't, but I'd like to try." And so James asked her if she'd come with him, and she said okay. And they went to this cafe, and they sat down, got coffees, and James explained to City who he was. And he told her he was a Japanese television producer who specialized in hidden camera prank videos. And he needed actresses to put on pretty clothes and pull pranks on unsuspecting people on camera. City had initially been very skeptical of James and this proposition, but at the same time, back then, prank videos were all the rage on YouTube, they were on mainstream TV, they were everywhere, and City knew that, but she had never thought about being in one. She just sometimes liked to watch them. But James would tell her, "This is really easy work, and you'll get paid well for it." And so City had ultimately said, "Okay, yeah, I'll do it with you." And after she said yes, her life had been a whirlwind. No longer was she a masseuse at a hotel, but instead, she was like a celebrity, flying all over the country, filming all these prank videos, and James's bosses were so pumped, they kept messaging him, telling him how amazing she was, and how every video she was doing was outperforming anything they hoped it could do. I mean, everything was going perfectly. City took a few more bites of her birthday cake, and then she checked her watch and saw it was almost 10 p.m., which for James and her other friends might be early, but for City, that was pretty late. Plus, she had already had a lot of alcohol that night, and so that was making her more tired. And so she told James and the others she was going to leave. She thanked them for the party, and then she headed out and went to her hotel. As soon as City was in her room, she immediately called her mother. City and her mom talked all the time, sometimes multiple times a day, and this night, City just really missed her mom, and she really missed her son. And as soon as she called her mom picked up and they chatted for a bit. And City told her all about how she'd had this amazing birthday party and how excited she was about the next day because they were shooting a really big prank. It was going to be their biggest one yet, and it would have the biggest payout of any of the videos she had done so far. This one, tomorrow, was going to pay her $100 US. And City told her mom, "Don't worry, I'm sending all of it back home to you all." City's mother was so thankful and so excited for her daughter, and she said, "That's wonderful, get a good night's sleep, and I'll be thinking of you tomorrow." And after that, City talked to her son for a couple of seconds, and then they hung up, and City crawled into bed, she turned off the light, and she tried to sleep, but she couldn't. She was too excited about tomorrow's shoot. She and James had been talking about this particular prank for the last week, and they'd been rehearsing it over and over again, and now here she was on the precipice of actually doing it in real life. The pranks that City did were all pretty similar and pretty simple. She and James would go to some train station or some hotel or some other public area, and they would identify an unsuspecting older man, and then City, all dressed up, would go up to this guy while she was being filmed at a distance, and she would either kiss the man on the cheek or spray him with perfume or rub chili oil on his hand, and then she would giggle and run away, and then the camera crew would zoom in on the man's face as he's kind of bewildered and trying to figure out why that had just happened. But tomorrow's prank, even though it was pretty similar to the ones she had done, it would be the first time she'd be working with another actor. In fact, two other actors. One of the actors was a woman who would be doing the pranking with City, and then their target, the unsuspecting man, was also an actor. James and the Japanese television production company had insisted that for this prank to work, this guy really did need to be in on it. City had already met and rehearsed a couple of times with the other woman who she'd be doing this prank with, but she had not met the third actor, the unsuspecting man, yet. She'd be meeting him the next day, actually during the prank. City would eventually fall asleep that night, and then her alarm would go off fairly early the next morning, and when it did, City immediately got out of bed and she got dressed in a dark form-fitting outfit, she put on some red lipstick, and then she hustled out of her room, downstairs, and out of the hotel to meet James, the woman actress she'd be working with that day, and the other producers who were involved in the production. Then, as a big group, they hopped in a cab and went to the international airport where this big prank was going to take place. And when they got there, they made their way to a restaurant in the departures area to wait for the third actor, the unsuspecting man, to show up so they could begin the shoot. And while they waited, City and the other actress she'd be working with struck up a conversation. The other actress's name was Duan Thi Huang, and she was a 28-year-old woman from Vietnam. And just like City, she had come from a poor family, and she had gone abroad to find work to help support her family, and it was during this time that she was abroad that she was recruited to star in these prank videos. But unlike City, who daydreamed about maybe being a singer or a model or an actress or something someday, for Doan, acting was the only thing she ever thought of. Her whole life, the only thing she ever wanted was to be an actress. In fact, Doan had left school to pursue a career in show business. She had been on a show called Vietnam Idol, but unfortunately did not make it past the first round, and she had actually done a few other prank videos with a different production company, but neither of those two ventures had ever really panned out. It wasn't until she was recruited by James and his team to be a part of these videos that Doan finally felt like she was on the right track. And as they talked, City couldn't help but feel like Doan was just a little bit weird. She did like Doan, she had no issues with her, but Doan had chose to wear, for this big shoot today, a very childish outfit. Instead of wearing something similar to what City had on, which City imagined she would be, Doan was wearing this weird childish looking t-shirt that just said LOL on it, and she was carrying around with her everywhere this huge oversized teddy bear. But City just chalked it up to, maybe James and the other producers told Doan to dress this way, and that's why. The group took their time at breakfast inside of this restaurant, just waiting for this third actor to show up. And finally, at 9 a.m., so after an hour of just sitting there, one of the producers actually said, "Hey,
there he is right there. And so City and Doan and James, they looked out into the very crowded area, and sure enough, where the producer was pointing was this guy who looked exactly like all of their other victims. He was this middle-aged, stocky guy carrying a briefcase who totally blended in with the hundreds of other people out there. And the producers told City and Doan that it looked like this actor had already begun the scene. He was already heading over to the self-check-in kiosk, which was like the start of this prank. And so they told City and Doan, like, go, start the prank. And so City grabbed the perfume that she was given to spray in this guy's face, and the producers rushed to rub this oil on Doan's hands, along with give her a wet cloth, because that was what she was going to need for her side of this prank. And then City and Doan stood up and began making their way out into the very crowded terminal. And as she walked, City couldn't help but feel very nervous, because she knew this was her big chance to show James and the other producers that she could work well with other actors, and that she could do a fairly complex prank. City and Doan made their way right behind the third actor, and as he continued to punch the screen of the self-serve kiosk, the two women split up, just like they had rehearsed. City walked around the man and got on the backside of this kiosk, basically looking at the man who was looking down at the computer screen, and Doan stayed where she was. And then Doan looked up at City and nodded, which was the signal, at which point City rushed forward right in front of this guy, who looked up and acted surprised, and then Doan ran up behind him and grabbed his face and rubbed her hands and that wet cloth all over his face, and then City, as soon as that was happening, sprayed the perfume on the guy's face as well, and then the two women kind of giggled and said sorry, and then walked away in separate directions. As City walked to the bathroom to wash the perfume off her hands, she was very conscious of the fact that she was still very likely being filmed, and so she checked her hair a couple of times and made sure her clothes were just right, and then she disappeared into the bathroom, she washed her hands, and then she looked up at the mirror and she smiled, because she knew she had nailed this prank and she was going to be a star. After City had finished washing up, she left the bathroom and made her way over to the meetup point, kind of on the other side of the airport, where Doan, James, and the other producers were going to meet up, but no one was there. And she thought that was weird, because they had totally planned to meet at this point after the prank. But after a little while, City told herself that, maybe they had already headed down to the taxi waiting area, and that's where they are, and they're waiting for me. So City left the airport and went to the taxi waiting area, but when she got there, she found herself alone again. And so City would stand there looking around, waiting for about 15 minutes, and when still she didn't see anybody, she texted James and said, where are you? But she didn't get a response, and so feeling kind of annoyed, City finally just flagged down a taxi on her own, hopped in, and told the driver she just wanted to go back to her hotel. And then on the drive to the hotel, City started to get car sick and kind of nauseous, and she figured it didn't help that she had drank a bunch the night before, so she was still a little bit hungover, and at some point she actually had to tell the driver to pull over so she could vomit outside. And so finally, when City got back to her hotel and got back to her room, she felt so crappy and she was so upset with how everything was going that she didn't even bother to get undressed. She just jumped into her bed and fell asleep. City would sleep for several hours, and when she woke up again, she still felt totally hungover and gross, and she rolled over and checked her phone, expecting to see a message from James explaining why they had ditched her after the prank, but there was no messages or phone calls from anyone. And so City was totally annoyed and frustrated, but just couldn't deal with this right now, and so she put her phone down and fell asleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, when City woke up, she felt like a brand new person. She was not hungover anymore. She rolled over and grabbed her phone, again expecting to see a message from James or someone. There wasn't anything, and so she called James. But as soon as she called him, she could tell his phone was now off. And so suddenly, City thought to herself, wait a minute, did the prank go badly? Did I do something wrong? Is that why they're ignoring me? And then also City thought to herself, am I still gonna get paid for this prank? I told my family I was sending them $100 US. All day that day, City would sit on her bed in the hotel and call and text James. But James never got back to her. And City did not have the contact info for the other actors or the other producers, and so she was just totally stuck, not really sure what to do. And she just couldn't understand it. I mean, even if it had gone really badly, if she had blown that prank for some reason, she had spent the past 4 weeks with these people, specifically James, flying all over the country with him, going to dinners with him. He had thrown her a birthday party. They had all these long conversations about life. What could she have possibly done that would
would warrant this kind of treatment. And so by the end of that day, when still City had heard nothing, she just felt totally heartbroken and embarrassed and decided, you know what, I'm done with those people. Tomorrow I'm going home to my family. And sure enough, the next day, City got up, she grabbed her things, she checked out of the hotel, she headed to the airport to fly back home. But as she was going through security, she heard all this commotion behind her, and she turned and she saw 6 heavily armed police officers sprinting in her direction. And so instinctively, City tried to get out of the way to let them run past her, but instead of the men running past her, they ran right up to her, grabbed her, flipped her around, and put her under arrest. And immediately, City's like, oh my goodness, this is what's been going on. They've been ghosting me for 2 days here because they were setting me up for another prank. I'm part of the prank now. James must be nearby filming, and they've sent these fake police officers to arrest me. And so this is all going to be on the show. And so feeling totally relieved, City began to laugh and said to one of the officers, oh, so this is a prank, huh? And the officer was like, no, this is real. You are under arrest. And when he told her what she was being arrested for, City nearly fainted. Here's what really happened during City's last big prank. After City and Do-won had run up on the third actor and Do-won rubbed that towel on his face and then City sprayed him with perfume, the 2 women had then disappeared into the crowd, and then the third actor just stood there staring blankly. And then he had kind of stumbled away from the kiosk over to a receptionist where he told her that he was feeling really dizzy. The receptionist could tell this guy definitely needed help. He was unsteady on his feet, his face was all wet, and he was speaking kind of frantically. And so she grabbed a few employees of the airport and they clustered around him and began walking him to the medical clinic that was in the airport. And as they escorted him to this clinic, the man began saying he was in so much pain and he kept walking slower and slower. And then finally, when they actually got him inside this clinic, just a couple of minutes later, he was on the ground having a seizure. Immediately, the medical staff rushed to the man's aid and they injected him with a medicine to stop the seizure. And then with the help of airport staff, they lifted him up, put him on a stretcher, and then rushed him to an ambulance that was supposed to take him to the hospital. But he would die on the way there. City and Do-won had no idea this had happened to the third actor after the prank. The 2 women had gone into separate bathrooms and then basically just missed each other. They came out staggered to the meeting point and they didn't see anyone. They both went down to the taxi waiting area thinking that's where everyone had gone. And again, City and Do-won just didn't see each other and they both got in their own taxis and went back to their own hotels. As for James and the other producers, the reason they were absent after this prank had ended is because they planned to be absent after this prank. As soon as they saw City and Do-won pulling off this prank successfully, they all got up from that restaurant and promptly rushed to board planes that would take them out of the country. Because James and these other producers were not really producers. They didn't have a prank show. It was all a charade. In reality, they worked for the North Korean government, and James, whose real name was Ri Ji-woo, had been tasked by the North Korean government to recruit gullible women, aka City and Do-won, to participate in a top-secret mission that could easily get them killed. In fact, this mission was so sensitive and so dangerous that James and his other TV producers had to live undercover for weeks with Do-won and City kind of slowly convincing them that this was all legitimate and that what they were going to do was just a prank, not a top secret mission. City and Do-won had both been recruited by James because they both were vulnerable and poor. City was also known to be very naive and believed anything she was told, and Do-won was very immature and childlike and overly trusting. All the prank videos that City and Do-won had been independently filming with James and their crew in the weeks leading up to this big final prank had not been episodes of a prank show. They were actually doing pranks on actual unsuspecting people, but it was all rehearsals. James and his crew wanted to make sure that City and Do-won, 1, thought this really was a prank show, and 2, that they were able to actually do the prank, that they wouldn't chicken out at the end. And on the morning of February 12th, 2017, the day of the big prank, which in reality was the big secret mission, the perfume that City was given was not really perfume, and the oil that was rubbed on Do-won's hands was not really oil. They were the ingredients for a deadly nerve gas called VX. Now, separately, these ingredients would not have harmed either of these 2 women. But when you combine those ingredients,
that's when it turns into a deadly poison. And so that was why City and Doan had been told to do this prank together, because James and his crew needed them to mix the VX gas on their target's face. And the target was not an actor. His name was Kim Jong-nam, and he had no idea what was going on when City and Doan touched his face and sprayed him with perfume, but he was dead within 20 minutes, and his death would have been exceptionally painful. It would turn out City and Doan had been tricked into participating in one of the biggest political assassinations in recent history, because Kim Jong-nam, the target, was actually the exiled brother of the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. And it's widely believed that Kim Jong-un is the one who actually authorized this assassination. Both City and Doan were initially charged with murder in Malaysia, which comes with an automatic death sentence, but those charges were quickly dropped when it was discovered that these two women were clearly victims as well. Surveillance video at the airport shows City and Doan handling the extremely deadly nerve agent ingredients so casually, and then after they pulled off their prank, which meant they now had VX gas on their hands, they casually were touching their hair and touching their clothes. It's obvious they have no idea what they're doing. The sickness that City started to feel after the prank was not a hangover. Those were symptoms of VX gas poisoning. It just wasn't enough to kill her. Neither James nor any of the other TV producers has ever been arrested, and to this day, North Korea still says they had nothing to do with this assassination. At the end of 2002, 36-year-old Boyd Taylor was single, he had no children, and he lived with his divorced father, Robert, in a small bungalow in the northern England countryside. In addition to living with his father, Boyd also worked for his father. His father, Robert, owned a small construction business, and so the father-son duo built houses in the area. While Boyd might have envisioned his life turning out in a different, more exciting way, he didn't seem outwardly unhappy about his circumstances. In fact, he seemed very cheerful, both at work and when he was at home. But despite his cheerfulness, his father, Robert, was still pretty concerned about him, because every time Boyd had some time off from work and was just at loose ends, he wouldn't go out with his friends. In fact, he really didn't have any friends and wasn't even trying to make any friends. Instead, he would just sit in his room all day and be totally by himself. Now, Robert knew his son was naturally a bit of a loner and always had been, but a part of him hoped that his son would just start going out and meeting new people, or at the very least, develop some sort of hobby that could occupy his mind. In late September of 2002, Robert was walking down the hallway of their bungalow when he passed by his son's bedroom door, and it was shut, and as he walked past, he heard inside of his son's room the sound of his son sawing some wood. And so he stopped for a second and he just listened, and when the sawing stopped for a second, Robert just knocked on the door. He was curious. He wanted to know what his son was doing. Boyd, instead of coming over to the door and opening it up and talking to his dad, instead just paused for a second and then said, "What is it, Dad? What do you need?" And Robert would say, "Well, I heard sawing and I just wanted to know what you were building." And so Boyd pauses again and then just says, "Well, I'm working on a woodworking project." And so Robert's like, "Well, can I poke my head in and actually see what you're building?" And Boyd, again, without opening the door, just tells his dad very politely that he wants to be left alone. And so Robert decides not to push the issue. Whatever he was doing, it was his business. And so he just told his son that, hey, if you need any help with anything, let me know. I'd be glad to help. And then Robert walked away. Over the next 2 months, every time Boyd was not working, so in the evenings and on the weekend, he would be locked inside of his bedroom, hammering and sawing away at this woodworking project. And over those 2 months, Robert would periodically walk down the hall and stand in front of his son's bedroom and knock on the door and try to get his son to let him in to just see what he was up to, not only because he just wanted to see what his son was doing, but because Robert was a carpenter by trade and so was just genuinely interested. But every time he asked to be let in, Boyd would very politely tell his father that he really just wants to be left alone, and Robert respected his wishes. In early December, Boyd approached his father and said, "Hey, would it be possible for me to take the next month off from work so I can focus on this woodworking project?" Now, for Robert, this was a massive inconvenience. This construction business that he owned was really just he and his son building the houses. And so if his son was not going to be working, then Robert would be solo on all of his projects for that month. But Robert's thinking to himself, my son has finally found a hobby that he's really into. I don't really know what it is, but clearly he's invested in it. And so he tells his son, "You know what?
that's fine. You take the whole month, and if you want more time in January, that's fine. You just let me know. So starting that first week in December, every time Robert would leave the house to go to work in the morning, he would leave to the sound of Boyd in his bedroom hammering and sawing and tinkering away at his woodworking project. And then several hours later, when Robert finally came back home, he'd walk into the house, and the first thing he would hear is his son still in his bedroom, still hammering and sawing away. When December finally ended and Robert expected his son to be done with his project and to finally show him what he's been working on, Boyd approached him and said, "Well, Dad, I'm not quite done with the project. I need about 2 more weeks." And so Robert said, "No problem. We'll talk in 2 weeks." So December rolled into January, and Boyd just continued to work all day long inside of his bedroom. Then on the evening of January 7th, Robert was home. He was watching TV in the living room, and Boyd was hard at work in his bedroom right down the hall when Robert decided he was tired and he was going to go to bed. So he stands up, turns the TV off, he leaves the living room, he goes down the hallway with his son's room on the right, and as he passed, he can hear his son at work, and he kind of yells to his son that he's going to bed. And then Robert goes into his bedroom, crawls into his bed, and falls asleep. At 3:30 a.m. the following morning, Robert is suddenly awoken by this incredibly loud crashing sound somewhere in his house. Robert's first thought was the chimney must have collapsed. That was how loud the sound was. And so he leaps out of his bed, he runs out of his door, he goes down the hallway, past his son's room, into the living room, and he looks at the fireplace, which is in the TV room, and clearly the chimney has not collapsed onto itself. And so he's standing there thinking, what else could that sound have been? And then he's thinking to himself, well, did I really hear that sound, or was that sound in my dream? And I kind of thought it was real, but it really wasn't. And so just to be sure, he walked all around the house, kind of seeing if there were any signs of something big falling and crashing on the ground, but the house seemed totally in order. And so he walked back down the hallway towards his bedroom, and he stopped right outside of his son's room, and he considered knocking and waking his son up to see if maybe he had heard this loud sound too. But when he listened to the door, it was quiet inside, so he figured, you know what, my son's asleep, I'm not going to wake him up for this. And so Robert just went into his bedroom and he went back to sleep. A few hours later, Robert got up and he left his bedroom, he went into the kitchen and he made himself some food. And as he's preparing his food, he's realizing that he doesn't hear the sound of Boyd working in his bedroom, because normally Boyd would be working that early in the morning, but he wasn't. And so right before Robert left to go to work that day, he actually walked down the hall and listened to his son's bedroom to hear if maybe he was at work in there, but he just hadn't heard him. But it was totally silent in the room. And so he reached down to the doorknob, thinking maybe he could just poke his head in and see if his son was on his bed. But when he tried the doorknob, it was locked. So Robert just thought to himself, okay, I guess Boyd is sleeping in this morning, and so I'm not going to bother him. And so Robert leaves the house, he gets into his truck, and he drives off to work. And then several hours later, he comes back to the house at night, and he walks inside, and the first thing he hears is nothing. It's silent. And this house in the evenings for the past several months was never quiet. Boyd was always hammering, sawing, and tinkering away at this woodworking project. And so right away, Robert's thinking to himself, maybe he's done with the project and I can finally see this thing he's been working on. And so Robert drops his stuff at the door and he walks down the hallway. He goes to his son's bedroom door and he knocks and he says, "Hey, Boyd, are you done with your project?" But he's met with silence. And so Robert reaches down again and tries the doorknob, but it's locked. And so Robert's standing there thinking, it's too early for him to be asleep. And so he yells out for Boyd, "Hey, what's going on? Where are you? I haven't seen you today. Come out here. Come talk to me." But again, it's silent. And so Robert's thinking, okay, well, when I pulled in, was his car in the driveway? And he can't remember. And so he leaves the house, he goes out to the driveway, and sure enough, there's Boyd's car. It's in the driveway. So he has to be here. And so suddenly Robert's starting to feel a little bit panicked about his son. He runs back into the house and he just starts screaming his son's name as he goes room to room into the bathrooms and the other bedrooms to see if he's in there, but he's nowhere to be found. And so operating on a gut instinct, Robert just runs right out to his car. He gets a sledgehammer, comes back in the house, goes down the hallway, and he's standing in front of his son's bedroom door. And one more time, he yells for his son and bangs on the door, tries to get his son's attention. But after once again there being total silence, he picks up his sledgehammer and begins breaking the door down. And after a couple of swings, he manages to pop off the locking mechanism, the actual doorknob. That gets blown off and he can push the door open and he sees inside the bedroom is empty. There's just a bed and a dresser and there's no Boyd. But in the back right corner of the room, where normally essentially there was like this alcove, basically a segment of his room kind of jutted away from the rest of the space, almost like it was a closet, but with no door on it. Boyd had clearly built a wall and door over that alcove, kind of creating a sort of sub-room within his bedroom. And this door was shut. And so Robert immediately runs over to this new second door. He tries the doorknob, it's locked. He yells for his son, but again, after silence, he picks the sledge up and begins trying to break this door down. And after a few good swings, like the first door, he was able to knock the doorknob off of the door. And then he reached down and he pulled the door open. And what he saw on the other side of this door, inside of this little sub-room, was so far from anything he ever expected that he just stood there in stunned silence. And then eventually reality kind of kicked back in and he ran out of his son's room and he called the police. 3 months earlier, Boyd had decided he wanted to build this very specific device that was invented in 1789. Now, he didn't want his father to know about this device, and so he built that door and wall frame in front of that alcove specifically so he could build this device inside of this new sub-room in privacy. He also always made sure to lock his main bedroom door. So for 3 months, Boyd began constructing this 8-foot tall, 3-foot wide structure inside of the subroom. And once the shell of this device was constructed, he began installing all of its inner workings. These included things like various lengths of wire and clock timers and a jigsaw, which is like an electric saw. And then finally, on January 7th, it was complete. So that night, Boyd blew up an air mattress and he slid it inside of the subroom right underneath this ancient machine he had built. And then after that, he went and locked the main bedroom door. He went into the subroom himself and shut the subroom door and locked that. And then he pulled 12 sleeping pills out of his pocket, swallowed those, and then laid down on this air mattress on his back, looking up at the inner workings of this machine. And then once he was positioned the way he wanted to, he reached over up inside of this machine and he felt around for a button that he had placed. He pressed that button and then he put his hands over his chest and he laid there looking straight up until the sleeping pills kicked in and he fell asleep. That button he pressed right before he passed out from the sleeping pills started a timer, and when that timer went off, it would actually activate this whole device. And so several hours after pressing that button, the timer finally went off at 3:30 a.m. The first thing that happened when this device was activated is the jigsaw, the electric saw, began sawing this wire. Now the wire had been very intentionally placed against the teeth of this jigsaw, and so it's cutting this wire, and this wire is supporting this weighted down heavy angular blade that's pointing straight down. And so as soon as this wire is cut, it releases the blade, and the blade that almost looks like this oversized axe head begins falling straight down this chute, and the chute aims the blade directly onto the front of Boyd's throat. Boyd's woodworking project was a guillotine, and that loud crashing sound that woke Robert up at 3:30 in the morning on January 8th, that was the sound of the blade of this guillotine crashing down and decapitating his son. Even though Boyd did not leave behind a note explaining his actions, it was determined Boyd's death was in fact a suicide, a very complicated and deliberate suicide. Boyd's father and other people involved in this case have come to the conclusion that Boyd was clearly showing signs of depression before he chose to take his own life. And so maybe if Boyd had reached out for help, or if there had been some sort of intervention, his death could have been prevented. And if you or anyone you know is struggling with mental health, remember, you are not alone. No matter how bad it feels, there are resources out there that can help you. And so I've listed a number of them in the description below. So that's going to do it, guys. In 2016, 21-year-old Darren Mitchell was living in Southeast Texas in a town called Navasota. He was serving in the U.S. National Guard, he was the proud father of a 1-year-old little girl, and he was engaged to the little girl's mother. Anyone that knew Darren knew his main goal in life was to support his little beloved family. While he personally really wanted to go to a trade school, he ended up putting his dream on hold to raise money so his fiancée could go to nursing school. And their plan was after she completed nursing school, Darren would then raise more money and go to school himself. That spring, Southeast Texas was hit with record rainfalls. It seemed like for Darren, every time he went to and from work, the sky was always gray and the road was always wet. But of all the thunderstorms that passed
passed through that area that year, there was none more powerful than the 24-hour thunderstorm that began on May 26th. That afternoon, Darren was on his way home from work. He was traveling along Texas State Highway 105. It was raining so hard that his windshield wipers literally could not keep up with the amount of water hitting his windshield. And so he eventually just had to slow way down just to make sure he didn't crash into anyone. He looked around him, and the fields and the ditches next to the road were already filling with water because the ground was already completely saturated from all the rainfall over the past couple of months. Before long, Darren found himself stopping right in the middle of the highway behind this huge row of traffic. Apparently there was some significant flooding up ahead on the road, and people were hesitant to drive through it. And so after a while, when this huge row of traffic was just not moving and the rain was just continuing to pour down, Darren started to worry he might be in an emergency situation, that this could be a flash flood scenario. And so he called his brother and he told him that he was stuck on Highway 105 because there was flooding up ahead, there was flooding behind him, he couldn't really go anywhere. And so his brother asked him, what are you going to do? And at some point Darren said, hey, I can actually get out my window, so I'm fine, I'll talk to you later. But after that, nobody heard from Darren. And later that afternoon, when Darren didn't make it home, his family got really concerned and they called the police. And so that night, a search was launched to find Darren, but there was no sign of him. But the next morning, they did discover Darren's blue pickup truck. It had flipped over. It was off the side of the highway near a river that had been created by the floodwaters. Darren was not inside of the vehicle, but 24 hours later, they did discover his body. He had drowned and he had drifted 1 mile downstream of his truck. The family was obviously devastated by this horrible loss, but they just could not reconcile how he had been on the phone with his brother saying that he was going to be just fine to just a couple days later being found dead. And it would turn out there was actually a witness that watched what happened to Darren. She had been caught up in this flash flood as well, except she was in a vehicle that did not get swept away. And so she was watching Darren as the floodwaters raged around his vehicle, and she said he climbed out of the window and he got into the bed of his pickup truck, and then from the bed he moved up to the roof of his truck, and at this point the waters began pulling his vehicle, and so his vehicle became unsteady. And from her perspective, it seemed like Darren did not like his odds on the roof of his truck, and so he climbed back inside of his truck. And then just a couple of minutes later, his vehicle was dragged into a deeper section of the water, and it flipped upside down and was pulled under, and Darren did not reemerge. With this information, Darren's family was able to figure out that when Darren climbed back into his truck right before it flipped over, he posted something to Facebook that now, looking back at it, is unbelievably haunting. Randy Weaver was a college dropout and a former Army Green Beret, which is the Army Special Forces. He and his wife Vicky were religious fundamentalists and deeply distrusted the government and believed the end of the world was imminent. In the early 1980s, they began hoarding guns and began making plans to live in some secluded area off the grid. In 1984, Randy, Vicky, and their children moved into a cabin they had built themselves overlooking Ruby Creek in Idaho. By choice, they had no electricity and no water. After receiving information that Randy had made threats against the President Ronald Reagan and other government officials, the FBI and the Secret Service began investigating him. Although no charges were ever filed against him, in their investigation, they discovered he had ties to the Aryan Nation, which is a white supremacist group. So in 1989, when Randy inadvertently sold 2 illegal weapons to undercover ATF agents, they said, instead of arresting you and sending you to jail, you can actually become an informant on the Aryan Nation. But Randy said he wasn't tied to the Aryan Nation and couldn't do that, and so they indicted him for making and keeping illegal weapons. After being released on bail in 1991, Randy missed his court date, and so a warrant was issued for his arrest. The U.S. Marshal Service was now responsible for bringing Randy in, but given his significant weapon arsenal and his anti-government stance, they assumed he would not go easily, and so they decided they would launch a secret surveillance campaign of Randy, his family, and where they lived to gain some intelligence on what they did day to day and find the right time to go up and apprehend him. So in early 1992, secret surveillance teams were set up all around the Weaver family cabin, and what they found was the Weaver family, despite being extremist, they mostly kept to themselves, and they definitely were not aware they were being watched. The only reason the marshals didn't just go up and apprehend him was because anytime the Weavers were outside of their cabin, they were always armed. A few months later, in August, as the surveillance teams were getting ready to set up for the day to gather more more intelligence on the Weavers, the Weaver dogs took notice of the surveillance teams and started charging into the woods barking like maniacs. And Randy, along with his friend Kevin Harris that was staying with them, and Randy's teenage son Sammy, took off after the dogs, not knowing that they were going to be running straight into a government surveillance team. And when these two parties encountered each other, a firefight ensued that left Sammy, Randy's son, dead, along with their dog dead, and one of the marshals, William Deegan, was killed as well. Who shot first and who shot whom would later be hotly debated by all the survivors in the courts and in the media. Immediately after the shooting stopped, Randy and Kevin turned around and ran back up to the cabin to take cover. Meanwhile, the surviving marshals ran out of the forest and they told their boss what had happened, and their boss is like, this is going to turn into a standoff, we need this to end right now. And so he called the FBI and he painted a picture of the Weaver family and Randy specifically as this enormous threat, that it had been this unprovoked attack on the marshals and that they got to come in force to put an end to this thing. And so the next day, hundreds of FBI agents, huge vehicles and helicopters, they all showed up in this little area in Idaho getting ready to do battle with the Weaver family. Because the FBI had been told the Weaver family was this huge threat, they authorized all of their snipers to shoot any armed adult without warning them. Normally, the FBI, if they see someone who's armed, they would yell at them to stop what they were doing, put their weapon down, warn them. Unless, of course, this person is actively shooting at them, then of course the FBI is going to shoot back. But if it's just an armed person standing there, the FBI can't just engage them. But in this situation, the FBI said, this threat is so big, we're changing the rules. And so you had all these FBI snipers all around the Weaver property that are all amped up, they're getting ready to engage the enemy, they're off safe, finger on trigger, slack out, ready to engage the first adult they see. And so it stayed like this for quite a while, a total stalemate, until Randy, Kevin Harris, and Randy's teenage daughter Sarah decided to leave their cabin and go down to Sammy to pay their respects. But Randy and Kevin were carrying weapons, and so after they left the cabin, they walked a little ways away, and then snipers opened up on them. In that initial volley of fire, only Randy got hit in the shoulder, and so Randy, Kevin, and Sarah, they turn, they start running back towards the cabin to take cover, and standing in the doorway of the cabin, inside the cabin, is Vicky, Randy's wife, and she's standing there holding their 10-month-old daughter, and so Randy makes it inside, Sarah makes it in the front door, Kevin is the last one to go through the door, and right as he's going through the doorway, the sniper had his sights set on Kevin, and he fired, he missed Kevin, the round went through the door, and it hit Vicky squarely in the head, and it killed her instantly. Adding insult to injury, the FBI did not know they had just killed their mother, and so after the shooting stopped and the door had shut and the Weavers are back inside the cabin, the FBI began calling out to them saying, Mrs. Weaver, come out, don't you want to protect your kids? Come out and we'll get you guys pancakes and you can sit with your kids. You got to get them out of there. But Vicky was dead, they just didn't know. Ultimately, the FBI went out and got a highly decorated Vietnam War veteran who had similar views to Randy, and they sent him in to try to convince Randy to stop this and surrender, and eventually he got Randy to do that, so no more blood was shed. Later, an investigation would show law enforcement that was handling this case made a number of really critical mistakes early on. The first big mistake being the miscommunication between the marshals to the FBI about how big of a threat the Weaver family really posed. Now, they certainly were a threat, but they were not such a big threat that they required hundreds of FBI agents and helicopters and armored vehicles. The second critical mistake was when the FBI authorized their snipers to shoot at armed adults without a warning. That's almost certainly why Vicky was killed. In the end, despite having a plethora of charges against him, jurors decided that Randy Weaver was only guilty of not showing up to that court date. Amid intense federal scrutiny of the Ruby Ridge scandal, the FBI's number 2 person was demoted, 3 other agents were suspended, and 1 was sent to jail for trying to cover up the mistakes the FBI had made during this case. As for the Weaver family, they were given a $3.1 million settlement by the government, and Kevin Harris had all charges dropped against him, and he won a 6-figure settlement. Of all the pictures that came out of Ruby Ridge, there's none more famous than this one taken by one of the surveillance teams of Vicky just before she was shot by that sniper. Scattered across the North American continent are many ghost towns, places that used to be vibrant and alive that are now dead and abandoned. In these places, you can find old churches and buildings and schools that are usually in a pretty significant state of decay. The reasons a town might die varies. Sometimes it's because a new railroad or highway is put in that bypasses the town, or the town has just exhausted all of their natural resources, which were the original draw to the town. Mining towns are a good example of that. Other reasons are wars, natural disasters, political
political wranglings. There's a whole bunch of reasons why towns just suddenly stop existing. But there's one ghost town in North America that has a really unique and very dark reason for why it ultimately was abandoned, and that town is Portlock, Alaska. Portlock, which is also called Port Chatham, is located on the farthest southwestern tip of the Kenai Peninsula. It's easily one of the most beautiful areas in all of Alaska, but it also happens to be very remote. And Portlock specifically, even by Kenai standards, is considered extremely remote. You can only get there by boat or by bush plane. The town was technically founded in 1787 when Captain Nathaniel Portlock of the Royal Navy landed there, but it wasn't really turned into a real settlement until the early 1900s when commercial fishermen built a cannery there. By 1921, the town's fishing economy was doing so well that the US government believed they would be the next major commercial fishing hub, and so they actually established a post office there. Everything seemed to be going great for Portlock until the 1930s, when rumors began seeping out along the Kenai Peninsula that there was something wrong with Portlock. Men from this cannery town were going missing at an alarming rate, and the few that were found again were always found dead and mutilated in a nearby lagoon. Initially, the townspeople believed these were bear attacks, but the natives of the Kenai Peninsula that found out about what was happening in Portlock, they stopped by and they said, those are not bear attacks. Those are almost certainly attacks by a creature we call the Nantina, which means half man, half beast. And they are tall, two-legged, hairy creatures that live in the forest right near you. Now, of course, this just sounds like folklore. But when you consider the fact that from 1930 to 1950, dozens of Portlock residents disappeared in that forest or were violently killed and then dumped in the lagoon right outside of the forest, it makes you wonder what's in the forest. But since none of the people who went missing were ever found alive again, there was never any good description of what it was that was causing them to disappear in the first place. Well, with the exception of one case. In 1943, John Meyer, who was a resident of Portlock, was at his campsite and he was crouched down when he felt something leap onto his back and start pummeling his head and hitting him on the side, and he kind of went into the fetal position, and then at some point his dog started barking and caused whatever was on his back to get scared and run off. And so John, who's been badly beaten, rolls over and he looks towards the tree line and he sees this enormous, tall, hairy man running into the woods. And so John gets up and he stumbles his way into town to try to get help, and he's able to tell someone what happened to him before he ultimately succumbs to his injuries and dies. After the John Meyer incident, another group of Portlock men were up in the forest doing some hunting when they discovered these enormous 18-inch long tracks, and they followed them to a clearing where it looked like there was this epic death struggle, that clearly two huge animals had gotten into a struggle here. There's blood everywhere, there's pieces of what looked like a bear or maybe a moose, and then these tracks continued out of this clearing and went right up the mountain, and the men did not dare follow those tracks to see whatever it was that emerged victorious in this clearing. Even the Alaskan newspapers began speculating that something was off about Portlock. This was more than just some crime being committed, that there's something happening there that we can't understand. And so by 1949, when people were still going missing mysteriously in the forest, and then other people were turning up dead and mutilated in the lagoon, the townspeople said, enough. This is an unsafe place to live. We don't know what's causing this, but we have to leave. And then practically overnight, the town evacuated, leaving behind most of their possessions. The only person that stayed a little bit longer was the postmaster, because he had to wait for the post office to be shut down. And he said it was horrifying that he would see things walking in the trees, and he would hear these horrible sounds, and so he was eager to get out of there. And so in early 1950, he was allowed to go, and then that was it. The population of Portlock went down to zero. After they left, none of the people from Portlock or any of their family members ever went back to Portlock. So the only people that have really ever gone back to Portlock are people that unfortunately wound up there, like in the 1970s when some fishermen got caught in a storm, and so they sought refuge in Portlock. But after setting up their camp, they saw something huge walk past them in the tree line, and it apparently was so terrifying that they literally packed up their camp, went back in their boat, and then went back out into the storm to avoid whatever it was they saw. Besides the fishermen, the only people that have gone to Portlock are people that want to come face to face with whatever it is that drove the people out of that town. But to put in perspective how few people do that, there's almost no modern photographs or videos of Portlock.
But there is one very eerie modern photograph of this building that's right in the heart of Portlock. It's one of the very few buildings that didn't collapse, and it's located right next to the forest where many of the men who went missing were last seen. And it's also not far from the lagoon where many of the dead men and dead people that were taken were found. And even if you don't believe there's some Nantina running around the forests of Portlock, you have to understand that something was killing and taking these people in the forest that you are looking at right now. And to date, we still have no idea what it was. Which means this is one of the creepiest pictures you will find on the internet. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please dress the like button in a realistic bear suit and then send them to the next Omante ritual in Japan. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same.